Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to push forward. There was more to this emotional tangle than just the sense of betrayal, more that needed to be brought into the light if she was ever going to make sense of it. And then there's the other part of it, she admitted, the words coming with difficulty. The fact that she hesitated, but her grandmother's patient gaze urged her on, a silent reassurance that whatever she was about to confess would be received without judgment. Kristin exhaled, steeling herself. The fact that I liked it, she confessed, the words tumbling out like a guilty secret. I liked how he made me feel. Once started, the admission seemed to gain momentum, each revelation building on the last, gaining speed like a boulder, rolling downhill. I liked how natural it all felt. She remembered their first kiss, how seamlessly they had moved together, how right it had felt to have his hands on her waist, his lips against hers. Nothing awkward or tentative about it. Just two people responding to a mutual attraction that had been building for weeks. I liked the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way he made me feel like I was special. The heat in his gaze whenever she entered a room. The reverent quality of his touch when they made love. The way he listened when she spoke, as if her thoughts and opinions were treasures to be valued rather than merely tolerated. She closed her eyes for a moment, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Vulnerability replacing her earlier defensiveness. He made me feel like me. Like Kristin wasn't just some new identity I had to get used to, but like I'd always been her. Like this body, this life, this version of me wasn't something I had to constantly think about or justify. It just was. With Daniel, she had never felt self-conscious about her femininity, never worried that some gesture or comment might reveal her as an imposter in this female form. His acceptance had been so complete, so unquestioning, that she had relaxed into herself in a way she hadn't been able to with anyone else. A tear slid down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the display of emotion, despite the intimate nature of their conversation. And now, I don't know if any of that was real. That was the crux of it, the uncertainty poisoning what had felt so genuine, so right. If he had known all along about her transformation, was his apparent acceptance genuine or manufactured? Had his desire been authentic or performance? She swallowed again, her voice barely a whisper now, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them more real, more devastating. I don't know if I let myself fall into something that was never real to begin with. I don't know if I was just a game to him. I don't know if I was just something interesting to him because of what I used to be. The possibility that everything she had felt with Daniel, the connection, the desire, the growing emotional attachment, might have been one-sided or based on false premises, was almost too painful to contemplate. And yet, she couldn't stop turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle, looking for clues she might have missed. She looked up at her grandmother, her eyes pleading for an answer she wasn't sure even existed. Gran had always been the source of wisdom in her life, the person who seemed to understand the complexities of the world better than anyone else. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it would be her. I don't know what to believe anymore. And for the first time since she had changed, Kristin felt truly lost. Not in the physical disorientation of the initial transformation, not in the social adjustment of living as a woman, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. Lost in her understanding of what was real and what wasn't, of who she could trust and who she couldn't. Gran's expression softened, maternal concern replacing her earlier neutrality. She reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Kristin's with gentle pressure. Then perhaps, she suggested softly, It's time you asked him directly. No running, no assumptions, just honest questions, and the courage to hear his answers. What if I don't like what I hear? Kristin asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath all her other concerns. Then at least you'll know the truth, Gran replied simply. And truth, however painful, is always preferable to uncertainty. Kristin wasn't sure she agreed with that assessment. Sometimes uncertainty, with its potential for hope, seemed far kinder than a devastating truth. But she knew her grandmother was right about one thing. She couldn't hide in this limbo forever. Sooner or later she would have to face Daniel and hear what he had to say. Whether she was ready for that conversation or not. Kristin sat there, her emotions raw and her thoughts still spinning, but her grandmother simply took a slow sip of her coffee, considering her words carefully. The older woman's expression was thoughtful, almost calculating, as if she were arranging a complicated spell in her mind before speaking it aloud. Her weathered fingers tapped gently against the ceramic mug, a subtle rhythm that seemed to match the ticking of the old kitchen clock. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Gran had never rushed these moments, had always given weight to silence as much as to words. It was one of the many things Kristin had come to appreciate about her grandmother's approach to important conversations. Nothing hasty, nothing reactive. Just measured consideration before speaking. Then, with a knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, she finally spoke, her voice carrying that particular tone of certainty that Kristin had learned never to dismiss lightly. Kristin, honey, I don't think it was like that at all. The simple statement carried an unmistakable conviction, as if Gran were commenting on an obvious truth rather than offering an interpretation of a complex situation. There was no hesitation, no qualifier, just pure, unwavering certainty. Kristin blinked, her fingers tightening around her mug, the ceramic warm against her skin. How can you be so sure? The question came out more defensive than she'd intended, a reflexive protection of her own interpretation. Her grandmother exhaled through her nose, setting down her cup with a small clink against the saucer. The sound was deliberate, punctuating the moment, drawing a clear line between what had been said before and what was about to be revealed. Because now that we know Daniel is a warlock, things make a lot more sense. The statement hung in the air, an invitation to see the situation through an entirely different lens. Gran's eyes held that particular gleam that appeared whenever she was about to reveal some critical piece of magical wisdom. The look that said she knew something important that Kristin had overlooked. Kristin frowned, waiting for her to continue, a mixture of skepticism and reluctant curiosity warring within her. Part of her wanted to cling to her interpretation, to the righteous anger that had propelled her flight yesterday. But another part, the part that had been falling for Daniel, despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, desperately wanted to believe there was another explanation. Think about it, her grandmother said, folding her hands in front of her with that familiar lecturer's posture she adopted when imparting particularly significant knowledge. Maybe he wasn't playing you. Maybe he was waiting for you to tell him yourself. Maybe he was just as scared and confused as you are. Kristin opened her mouth to argue, a rebuttal already forming on her tongue, but the words died there, unspoken. Because the perspective her grandmother offered wasn't just possible, it was plausible. More than plausible, it aligned with everything she knew about Daniel's character. Because, what if that was true? The possibility sent a tremor through her certainty, a hairline crack in the narrative she'd constructed. If Daniel hadn't been amusing himself at her expense, if he hadn't been studying her like some magical specimen, if his motives had been entirely different than she'd assumed. What if Daniel had been waiting for her to trust him enough to share her secret, waiting for her to feel secure enough in their relationship to reveal her past, waiting not out of manipulation or voyeuristic curiosity, but out of respect for her privacy and her journey? What if he hadn't said anything because he didn't want to force her to talk about her past? just like he hadn't immediately told her about his. After all, Daniel hadn't volunteered his own magical heritage. He hadn't introduced himself as Daniel Carter, warlock heir, when they first met. He had kept his own supernatural identity private, revealing it only when circumstances forced his hand. He was in a delicate position, Gran continued, seeming to follow Kristin's thoughts as they evolved. Imagine knowing something so personal about someone, something they clearly weren't ready to discuss, and trying to navigate a growing attraction without betraying that knowledge. Kristin bit her lip, considering this angle. But why not just, I don't know, hint at it? Give me an opening. Something to let me know it was safe to tell him. Perhaps he tried, Gran suggested, raising an eyebrow. Perhaps there were moments when he gave you opportunities that you didn't recognize, or weren't ready to take. Kristin thought back over their interactions, searching for those potential openings. Had there been moments when Daniel had seemed on the verge of saying something significant? Times when the conversation had veered close to topics of transformation or identity, only for her to steer them back to safer ground. Her grandmother leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm, carrying an undercurrent of absolute conviction that was impossible to dismiss. But I will tell you this, Kristin. The man you left behind yesterday, he wasn't playing games. He wasn't leading you along. He was truly worried about you. The image of Daniel's face just before she teleported flashed through Kristin's mind, the genuine concern in his eyes, the way he had reached for her, not to restrain, but to connect. There had been no calculation there, no manipulation, just raw emotion. How do you know? She asked, not challenging but genuinely curious. You barely spent any time with him. I've been reading people for over 70 years, Gran replied with a hint of indignation. Magical and non-magical alike. I know genuine emotion when I see it, and that man was devastated when you disappeared. Kristin swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. You really think so? Her grandmother chuckled knowingly, the sound warm and rich with decades of experience in matters of the heart. Her eyes twinkled with a mixture of amusement and affection as she delivered her assessment. Honey, I haven't seen a man look at a woman the way that Daniel looks at you since my husband looked at me. The comparison landed with surprising force. Gran's marriage had been legendary in their family, a partnership of equals, a love affair that had endured for nearly 5 decades, until her grandfather's death. She spoke of him rarely but always with that particular softening of her features, that gentle reverence reserved only for him. To have her compare Daniel's gaze to that standard was significant. Kristin's breath hitched, her heart suddenly pounding for an entirely different reason. Not from fear or anger, but from a surge of hope so powerful it was almost painful. The possibility that what she and Daniel had begun building together might be genuine, might be based on something real despite the complications and secrets, it was almost too much to contemplate. After you left, Gran continued, he stayed for hours, asking questions about you, about how the transformation spell worked, about what you might be feeling. He was trying to understand, Kristin. Not to satisfy idle curiosity, but because he wanted to know how to make things right. He did. The question came out small, vulnerable. He did, Gran confirmed. And let me tell you, I've rarely been interrogated so thoroughly by someone not of our bloodline. That man absorbed magical theory like he was cramming for finals. The mental image of Daniel sitting in Gran's living room, intently listening to explanations of transformation magic, asking pointed questions, taking in every detail that might help him understand her situation better, it softened something in Kristin's chest, melting the hard edges of her hurt and confusion. Her grandmother smirked, the playfulness returning to her eyes as she decided to lighten the mood. He's a keeper. And as a bonus, you don't have to hide the fact that you're a witch, do you? The observation was so practical, so refreshingly straightforward amid all the emotional complexity, that Kristin couldn't help but respond. Kristin let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head at the simple truth of it. I guess there's that silver lining. No, she didn't have to hide that part of herself from him. No more careful editing of weekend plans to avoid mentioning magical lessons. No more vague explanations about family traditions when discussing her grandmother. No more worrying that he might someday walk in on her practicing a spell or brewing a potion. One secret at least would no longer stand between them. And he's from a magical lineage even older than ours, Gran added, with a hint of impressed approval. The Carters have been practicing specific forms of business and prosperity magic since before this country was founded. Very exclusive, very powerful. Quite the catch if you're interested in magical pedigree. I'm not sure I care about magical pedigree, Kristin replied, though she couldn't deny a flicker of interest in learning more about Daniel's heritage, about the traditions and practices that had shaped him. Well, you should, Gran sniffed. These things matter in certain circles. But more importantly, her expression softened again. He cares about you. That much was abundantly clear. Before Kristin could respond, her grandmother stood with surprising agility for a woman her age, picking up her empty plate and walking back to the kitchen sink. The movement was deliberate, a physical punctuation to the conversation, a signal that everything that needed to be said had been said. And it was now time for action, rather than further discussion. Now, shoo, she said over her shoulder, waving a hand dismissively as she began rinsing dishes. You have a hunky man to go make up with. The casual command, delivered with Gran's characteristic blend of authority and humor, startled a genuine laugh from Kristin. Hunky? Really, Gran? She teased, grateful for the momentary lightness after such an emotionally charged conversation. I may be old, but I'm not blind, her grandmother retorted without missing a beat. The man looks like he walked off the cover of one of those romance novels Meredith keeps hidden in her nightstand. Aunt Meredith reads romance novels, Kristin asked, momentarily distracted by this new information about her prim and proper aunt. The steamier the better, Gran confirmed with a wicked grin. Now stop changing the subject and go fix things with your warlock before someone else snatches him up. Magical men of his caliber don't stay single for long, you know. I know. Kristin sat there for a moment, watching her grandmother move around the kitchen like this was just another morning, rinsing dishes, wiping counters, humming softly under her breath. The normalcy of it was both comforting and surreal after all the revelations of the past 24 hours. But it wasn't just another morning. Things had changed. Everything had changed. Her understanding of Daniel, her perspective on their relationship, her interpretation of his motives and actions. What had seemed like betrayal through one lens now appeared more complex, more nuanced through another. And now, Kristin had a choice to make. She could cling to her hurt, to the safe certainty of feeling wronged. Or she could take a risk, reach out, and give Daniel the opportunity to explain himself, to share his side of the story. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. The decision felt momentous and simple, all at once. A pivot point she could feel even as she moved through it. I'll need to clean up first, she said, glancing down at her rumpled clothes from yesterday. I can't exactly have this conversation looking like I slept in my clothes. Second drawer in your old dresser, Gran replied without turning around. I took the liberty of putting some fresh things in there. Nothing fancy, but clean at least. Of course she had. Gran had anticipated this, had prepared for it, had known Kristin would eventually need to return to Daniel, and had made certain she could do so looking presentable. Thank you, Kristin, said softly, knowing the gratitude extended far beyond the practical consideration of clean clothes. Gran nodded, a simple acknowledgement that encompassed all the unspoken layers of their connection. Mentor and student, grandmother and granddaughter, witch and witch, woman and woman. "Go on then," she said gently. "It's time to face Daniel." It was time, indeed. Time to confront not just Daniel, but her own fears, her own assumptions, her own capacity for forgiveness and understanding. Time to decide what mattered more, pride or possibility. As Kristin headed upstairs to change, she found herself hoping that Gran was right, that what she and Daniel had built together was genuine, worth fighting for, worth the risk of further vulnerability. Because if it was real, then maybe they had a chance at something neither of them had anticipated when they first met. Something unexpected and valuable, complicated but genuine. Something worth returning for. Kristin stood outside Daniel's door, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd spent the entire taxi ride rehearsing what she might say, practicing explanations and questions, but now that she was actually here, all those carefully prepared words had evaporated. Her grandmother's words had given her clarity, but that didn't mean this was easy. The possibility that she had misinterpreted Daniel's intentions was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant their connection might be genuine. Terrifying because it meant confronting her own hasty assumptions and emotional reaction. She was still nervous. Each breath felt shallow, insufficient, as if her lungs had shrunk overnight. Her palms were clammy, and she resisted the urge to wipe them against the borrowed jeans Gran had provided. Still uncertain. Despite Gran's confident assessment of Daniel's feelings, Kristin couldn't quite silence the doubts whispering in the back of her mind. What if Gran was wrong? What if her interpretation was clouded by romantic notions or wishful thinking? Still afraid of what she might hear. Because even if Daniel's motives weren't what she had feared, there was still the possibility that her dramatic exit had changed things between them. Perhaps he'd had time to reconsider, to decide that a witch with her particular history was more complication than he wanted in his life. "Stop stalling," she muttered to herself, squaring her shoulders. "You teleported away from the man. The least you can do is face him now." She raised her hand and barely got out a single knock. Her knuckles had barely made contact with the polished wood door before the door swung open. The suddenness of it startled her, making her take half a step back. He'd been there, right on the other side, as if he'd been waiting. Or perhaps, and the thought sent a small shiver through her, he'd sensed her magical signature approaching. And there he was, Daniel, standing in the doorway, looking both exactly the same and somehow different. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. He wore a simple gray Henley that clung to his broad shoulders and dark jeans that hugged his legs in a way that would have been thoroughly distracting under different circumstances. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. Those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through all her defenses. His expression was unreadable for a moment, a carefully neutral mask that revealed nothing of what might be happening behind it. But the second their eyes met, Kristin felt her nerves slam into her, all over again. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch, a focus that made her feel simultaneously exposed and anchored. He didn't say anything, simply stepped aside, silently inviting her in. The gesture was graceful, deliberate, giving her the choice to enter or retreat, applying no pressure either way. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, before stepping forward, past him, into his home. The familiar space hit her with unexpected emotional force, the sleek modern furniture, the wall of windows overlooking the city, the subtle masculine touches that were uniquely Daniel. It had been less than 48 hours since she'd been here last, laughing in his kitchen, sharing his bed, feeling like she belonged. Now everything felt different, charged with unspoken tension and uncertainty. It was only once she reached the couch that she realized how stiff her body felt, how every muscle was coiled tight with anxiety. She sat down with what she hoped was casual grace, but suspected was closer to awkward rigidity. Her back was too straight, her posture too formal for someone who had been so comfortably sprawled across this same couch just days before. She sat down, hands in her lap, staring at the floor as she tried to gather herself. The polished hardwood was a safe focal point, demanding nothing, expecting nothing, giving her a moment to collect her scattered thoughts and racing emotions. Daniel, ever perceptive, didn't push. There was no barrage of questions, no demands for explanations about her dramatic exit, no recriminations for leaving him with her grandmother to sort through the aftermath. Instead of sitting next to her, he sat across from her, giving her space, as if he knew that crowding her right now would only make things worse. He chose the armchair opposite the couch, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture attentive but not looming. "Coffee," he offered, his voice carefully neutral. "Or tea? I have that herbal blend you liked last time." The simple offer of hospitality, so normal and mundane amid the emotional complexity between them, almost made Kristin laugh. Or cry. She wasn't entirely sure which. "No, thank you," she replied, her own voice sounding strangely formal to her ears. "I had plenty at my grandmother's." Daniel nodded, accepting the refusal without comment. He didn't immediately try to fill the silence that followed, didn't nervously ramble or pressure her to explain why she'd come. He simply waited, patient and still, giving her the space to speak when she was ready. And for a while, there was only silence. Not comfortable, not exactly uncomfortable either, just waited, pregnant with all the things that needed to be said, but hadn't yet found their way into words. Through the large windows, sunlight played across the hardwood floors, creating shifting patterns as clouds passed overhead. A clock ticked somewhere in the apartment, marking the passage of seconds that stretched into minutes. In the distance, the muted sounds of the city created a soft ambient backdrop. Car horns, sirens, the constant hum of urban life, continuing just beyond the bubble of tension they currently occupied. Kristin wasn't sure how much time passed before she finally found the courage to speak. It could have been 3 minutes or 15. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting according to the rhythm of her anxiety, rather than the steady tick of the clock. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was so soft, barely above a whisper, the words emerging, hesitant and vulnerable. "Was it just a game?" "Why?" 4 simple words that encompassed all her fears, all her uncertainty, all the questions that had been tormenting her since yesterday's revelation. Was she an experiment, a curiosity, a novelty to be explored and discarded? Daniel's reaction was immediate. "No." His voice was firm, certain. The single syllable resonated in the quiet room, carrying a weight and conviction that couldn't be mistaken for anything but absolute truth. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no room for misinterpretation. Just that one word, delivered with such clarity and force that it seemed to physically dispel some of the tension hanging in the air between them. Kristin slowly looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since entering his apartment. The intensity she found there almost made her look away again. His eyes were fixed on her with a focus that was both intimidating and exhilarating. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair before leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, reducing the physical distance between them, even as he maintained the emotional space she seemed to need. "Yes, I knew about you," he admitted, his voice steady, open. "Yes, I knew you were a witch too. But I wanted to wait until you were ready to tell me." The confession hung between them, not a revelation exactly. She already knew this much from yesterday. But delivered now, with a calmness and clarity that had been absent in the chaos of their previous encounter. Kristin swallowed hard, absorbing his words, searching them for hidden meanings or evasions but finding none. There was just simple truth, offered without embellishment or excuse. "I sensed something different about you from our first meeting," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not specifically that you'd undergone a transformation spell, just that your magical signature was unusual, complex in a way I hadn't encountered before. It was," he paused, searching for the right word, "intriguing." "Intriguing," Kristin repeated, not quite a question, not quite an accusation. Just testing the word, seeing if it carried the negative connotations she feared. "Yes, intriguing," Daniel confirmed, no defensiveness in his tone. "The same way your mind is intriguing. The same way your talent is intriguing. The same way everything about you draws me in and makes me want to know more." There was a warmth in his voice as he said this, a genuine appreciation that made it difficult to maintain her emotional distance, to hold on to the hurt and suspicion that had propelled her flight yesterday. "I didn't mean for us to get so far before we had that conversation," he continued, his voice softer now, carrying a hint of regret. "I kept waiting for the right moment. Kept thinking after this meeting or after this date, I'd find a way to bring it up. But, Kristin," he paused, the way he said her name sending a small shiver down her spine, "you have this way of making me lose all reason." The admission was unexpected. Daniel Carter, always controlled, always composed, confessing that she had the power to disrupt his carefully ordered thoughts, to make him set aside his plans and intentions. Kristin's breath caught at the way he said her name, the warmth in his voice, the way he looked at her. Like she was the only person in the world, like nothing else mattered in that moment, but her and this conversation between them. She felt her face heat up, a small blush creeping up her cheeks, betraying her body's response to him, even as her mind still processed his words, still evaluated their truth and implications. Damn him. Sigh. Even now, he could fluster her so easily. Even amid this serious conversation, with so much at stake between them, he could say something that bypassed all her carefully constructed defenses, and went straight to that place inside her that responded to him on an almost primal level. "You're doing it again," she murmured, a hint of accusation in her tone, though not without a trace of reluctant amusement. Daniel blinked, genuinely confused. "Doing what?" "That thing where you say exactly the right thing to make me forget I'm supposed to be angry with you." His lips quirked in a small, almost apologetic smile. "If it helps, I'm not doing it on purpose. I'm just telling you the truth." And that was the problem, wasn't it? He sounded sincere. He looked sincere. Everything about him projected nothing but honest emotion and genuine regret for the misunderstanding between them. It was becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to her suspicions in the face of such apparent authenticity.